Welcome to the Level 2 training module for Core Requirement 6, Sorting, Categorization, and Processing, which explains the fundamentals of this section in greater detail. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding of R2 requirements, it's not intended to be used as a standalone guide. For the official text of all R2 requirements, download the R2 v3 standard from the SERI website. The general principle of Core 6 is to evaluate, sort, and categorize all equipment, components, and materials in accordance with the R2 Equipment Categorization Reference Document to ensure the applicable R2 requirements are followed throughout processing and outbound through the downstream recycling chain. Equipment and components may change categorization through stages of processing. A note before we get started. Core Requirement 6 relies on the use of the R2 Equipment Categorization Reference Document, otherwise called the REC. It's a reference document that contains standardized categories for identifying the R2 applicability, data sanitization status, cosmetic condition, and levels of functionality of electronic equipment, components, and materials. While it's preferable for facilities to use the REC categories, it's permissible for facilities to use their own internal categories if they're mapped to the corresponding REC categories. Although use of the REC is necessary to fulfill many R2 requirements, the REC itself does not contain any auditable requirements. Core 6, Sorting, Categorization, and Processing, addresses one of the major activities common to every R2 facility: how to determine the applicable R2 requirements and next process steps for the various electronic equipment, components, and materials that enter the control of an R2 facility. There are 5 elements to this requirement: documentation. Develop and maintain a documented process to identify, evaluate, sort, and categorize all electronic equipment, components, and materials. Categorize. Identify and update as necessary the applicable R2 equipment categories throughout the entire process. Evaluate. Evaluate all items to determine capability of reuse. Process. Direct the evaluated items to the next appropriate R2 process. And output. Identify and prepare the items for transfer in accordance with the planned process. Let's examine each of these areas in detail. The first step in the sorting and categorization process is to define and document how the electronic equipment will be identified, evaluated for reuse, and sorted for R2 processing. Documenting this process ensures the consistent identification and evaluation of all material streams, including any changes to categories as a result of processing. There are 5 required items that R2 facilities must incorporate in their documented process: the hierarchy for responsible management strategies to prioritize reuse over other disposition methods, all applicable REC categories, the methods to identify all data storage devices, the processes used by the facility to evaluate and sort for reuse, and finally, the steps to reevaluate R2-controlled streams to identify any changes in categories. The next main section of Core 6 deals with categorization. When equipment, components, or materials enter the control of an R2 facility, they are in an unknown state, so they must be treated as an R2-controlled stream. An R2-controlled stream is defined as electronic equipment, components, or material streams that are subject to the requirements of the R2 standard for processing and disposition. To ensure all items are managed in accordance with the correct R2 requirements, they must be identified and categorized using the REC. When categorizing, a facility can recognize the categories assigned by an R2 certified supplier or recognize the categories assigned by a non-R2 supplier if an evaluation and sampling process to confirm the categorizations is in place. The facility can also categorize based on appropriate test and verification records. Streams that no longer meet the definition of an R2-controlled stream require no further categorization or R2 processing and controls. These streams are referred to as unrestricted streams in the REC and the R2 standard. The next step in the process is to evaluate all items to determine the capability of reuse. The evaluation process must determine whether the equipment and components are capable of reuse based on the physical condition, functionality, and value in the destination market. After this evaluation, the facility must direct the items to the next appropriate R2 process. After the evaluation for reuse, the next step is to evaluate for data sanitization status in accordance with the REC. items must be identified as either pre-sanitization or non-data. Any items categorized as pre-sanitization and may contain data must be secured and controlled to prevent unauthorized access or theft until the items are processed in accordance with Core Requirement 7, Data Security. An important note about reuse. An R2 facility may not reuse, sell, or donate any equipment or components if reuse is prohibited in writing by the supplier. For all items evaluated as capable of reuse, the R2 facility must either assign a unique identifier to each piece of whole equipment or assign a batch identifier to non-serialized equipment and to components such as RAM sticks or AC adapters. Items identified for reuse must be directed to one of the following approved reuse processes. The R2 facility can test, repair, and refurbish in accordance with Appendix C, Test and Repair, or transfer the items to a qualified downstream vendor for testing, repair, and refurbishing in accordance with Appendix A, or specialty equipment can also be verified in accordance with Appendix D for specialty electronics reuse, or transferred under the 1% criteria of Core 6E, Section 3A. For items that are not capable of reuse and still require further R2 processing, the R2 facility must process the materials internally following Appendix E, Materials Recovery, or transfer the materials to a downstream vendor that has been qualified by the R2 facility in accordance with Appendix A, Downstream Recycling Chain. The final section of Core 6 addresses outputs of equipment and materials that are no longer R2-controlled streams. These include unrestricted streams, which are defined in the REC as electronic equipment, components, and materials that do not require R2 processing or downstream vendor verification, or functioning products, or collectible and specialty electronics. Unrestricted streams must be identified and managed separate from the R2-controlled streams, have appropriate justification for the unrestricted classification, and have records tracking the type of stream and the evidence of transfers. All functioning products as defined in the REC must be identified with the appropriate REC categories and reference the unique identifier in commercial sales and shipping records. Prior to shipment of functioning products, the import-export requirements must be identified in accordance with the legal compliance plan, and the contents must be packaged appropriately to protect items during transport. And finally, facilities must make their product return policy available to potential buyers. To summarize, Core 6 requires that all electronic equipment, components, and materials are properly identified, sorted, categorized, and directed to the appropriate processing path. For more information about the R2 v3 standard, visit the R2 Knowledge Base on the SERI website.